I discovered 70 million pounds behind a crumbling wall on the same day I was meant to lose everything I had ever loved. But the true treasure I found, that winter was not gold or jewels. It was a man who had forgotten how to feel, and a heart I never knew I possessed. My name is Flora Pemberton, and I have spent the better part of my adult life learning the art of invisibility. To be a maid in a great house is to move like a ghost through gilded hallways, to know every secret whispered in shadowed corners while pretending to know nothing at all, to love a place that will never truly belong to you, and to serve a master who may never see you as anything more than a function of his household. For 12 years, I performed this delicate dance within the walls of Ashcroft Hall, and I performed it well, perhaps too well, for it meant that when everything changed, no one expected me to be the one standing at the center of it all. I came to Ashcroft Hall in the autumn of my 18th year, fresh from the poorhouse in Whitby, where I had spent the lonely years following my parents' deaths. Consumption had taken my mother first, then my father 3 months later, as if his heart simply could not bear to beat without her. I had no siblings, no relatives who would claim me, and so I learned early that survival meant making oneself useful. The matron of the poorhouse, a stern woman named Mrs. Hartley, recognized something in me, some capacity for hard work and discretion, and when she heard that the great Ashcroft Hall required a new housemaid, she put my name forward without hesitation. The morning of my departure from the poorhouse remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. I had packed my few possessions in a small canvas bag, a spare dress, a worn shawl, the Bible that had belonged to my mother. Mrs. Hartley pressed a coin into my palm and told me to work hard and keep my head down, advice that would serve me well in the years to come. I remember walking out through the iron gates, feeling them close behind me with a finality that was both terrifying and liberating. Whatever happened next, I would not return to this place. I would make my own way in the world or die trying. I remember the day I first saw the manor as if it were yesterday. The carriage had deposited me at the end of a long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches forming a canopy overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. Through the gaps in the leaves, I caught glimpses of gray stone and tall windows, and as I walked closer, the full magnificence of Ashcroft Hall revealed itself to me. It was a house built for giants, I thought, with its soaring towers and endless wings, its gardens stretching toward the horizon like a green sea. I had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying in all my life. The housekeeper who greeted me was a woman named Mrs. Clements, whose silver hair was always pinned in a perfect coil at the nape of her neck, and whose eyes missed nothing. She explained the rules of the household with the precision of a military general, and I listened with the desperate attention of someone who knew that this position was her only chance at a respectable life. I would rise at 5, she told me. I would clean the grates and light the fires before the family stirred. I would be silent, efficient, and above all, forgettable. And so I became forgettable. I learned to walk without making a sound, to enter rooms as if carried by the air itself, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. I learned the rhythms of the house, the creaking of the third stair that must be avoided, the draft in the east wing that required an extra log on the fire, the particular way the morning light fell through the library windows and illuminated the dust motes like dancing spirits. I learned, too, the rhythms of its inhabitants, though in those early years there were precious few of them. The work was hard, harder than anything I had known before. My days began before dawn and ended long after dark, and every hour between was filled with labor. I scrubbed floors until my hands cracked and bled. I carried coal scuttles that weighed nearly as much as I did. I polished silver until I could see my own exhausted face reflected in its surface, a face that grew older and more worn with each passing year. But I did not complain. I could not afford to complain. The poorhouse had taught me that there were worse fates than hard work, and I was grateful for the roof over my head, the meals in my stomach, the wage that I carefully saved each month. Someday, I told myself, I would have enough put by to secure my future. Someday, I would not have to depend on the goodwill of others for my survival. What I did not expect was that Ashcroft Hall would become more than a place of employment. I did not expect to fall in love with its ancient walls and echoing corridors, its secret gardens and hidden alcoves. I did not expect to feel a sense of belonging within its embrace, as if the house had chosen me, had claimed me as its own. And I certainly did not expect to fall in love with its master. But I am getting ahead of myself. The old Duke, Lord Reginald Fitzroy, was already in his declining years when I arrived. He spent most of his days in a wheeled chair by the fire, his mind wandering through memories that seemed more real to him than the present. His wife, the Duchess, had died a decade before I came, and the house still bore the weight of her absence in 1,000 small ways. In the vase that was never filled with flowers, in the pianoforte that was never played, in the portrait that hung above the mantel in the drawing room, showing a beautiful woman with sad eyes and a gentle smile. The Duke would sometimes speak to that portrait as if she could hear him, and I would pretend not to notice as I swept the ashes from the hearth. The only other permanent resident of the house in those days was Lady Dorothea Fitzroy, the Duke's younger sister, a widow who had returned to her childhood home after the death of her husband, the Earl of Hartington. Lady Dorothea was a woman of 60 when I first met her, but she possessed an energy and sharpness that belied her years. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and piercing, and she had a way of looking at a person that made one feel as though every secret thought was being catalogued and filed away for future reference. She frightened me at first, this formidable woman with her silk dresses and her cutting remarks, but over the years I came to understand that her severity masked a deep well of loyalty and love for her family. And then there was the young master, Lord Ambrose Fitzroy, the Duke's only surviving son and heir. I did not meet him until I had been at Ashcroft Hall for nearly a year, for he spent most of his time in London, attending to business and, if the whispers of the other servants were to be believed, attending to pleasures of a less respectable nature. But when he finally came home for Christmas in my 2nd year of service, I understood immediately why the housemaids giggled and blushed whenever his name was mentioned. He was, quite simply, the most handsome man I had ever seen. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of chestnuts and eyes like amber in firelight, he moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never known want or uncertainty. But there was something else in his face, something that I noticed even then, beneath the practiced charm and the aristocratic bearing. There was a sadness there, a loneliness that echoed my own, though I could not have said why a man who possessed everything should look as though he had lost something precious. I learned over time that he had. His mother's death when he was just 20 had broken something in him, and his relationship with his father had never recovered from the grief they could not share. He stayed away from Ashcroft Hall because the memories were too painful, and when he did return, he armored himself in coldness and distance, speaking to the servants only when necessary, and spending his days alone in the library or riding across the moors until exhaustion drove him home. I watched him from a distance, as was proper, and I told myself that the flutter in my chest when he entered a room was nothing more than the natural nervousness of a servant in the presence of her master. I was not so foolish as to harbor romantic notions about a duke's son. I knew my place in the world, and I knew that the distance between us was as vast and uncrossable as the ocean itself. And yet, I could not stop myself from noticing things. The way he smiled, rare as it was, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. The way he spoke to his father with a gentleness that contradicted his cold exterior. The way he once paused in the hallway to pick up a book I had dropped, handing it back to me with a murmured word of thanks that left me speechless for hours afterward. I treasured that moment like a miser treasures gold. I replayed it in my mind each night as I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, analyzing every detail, every inflection, every breath. He had looked at me. He had spoken to me. he had acknowledged my existence, if only for a moment. It was nothing, of course. It meant nothing. But to a girl who had spent her life being overlooked and forgotten, it meant everything. The years passed, and Ambrose came and went from Ashcroft Hall like a shadow, never staying long, never allowing himself to become part of the daily rhythm of the household. I watched him age from a young man into something harder and more closed off, watched the light in his eyes dim as the weight of his responsibilities pressed down upon him. I wished sometimes that I could help him, that I could say something to ease his burden. But what could a servant offer a duke? What comfort could I possibly provide? So I did what servants do. I watched, and I waited, and I kept my feelings locked away in the secret places of my heart. These small moments accumulated over the years like snowflakes building into a drift, and before I knew it, I had fallen in love with a man who did not know my name. The years passed, as years do, bringing changes both gradual and sudden. The old Duke died in my 5th year of service, slipping away peacefully in his sleep as the first snow of winter fell outside his window. Lord Ambrose became the Duke of Ashcroft, and with the title came responsibilities that kept him at the estate more often than before. I saw him nearly every day now, though he rarely saw me. I continued my work, continued my careful invisibility, and continued to love him in the secret chambers of my heart where no one could judge me for my foolishness. But if the title brought Ambrose home, it also brought troubles that I only gradually came to understand. The whispers among the servants grew more frequent and more worried as the years went on. There were debts, they said, accumulated over generations by dukes who spent more than they earned and invested in ventures that failed. There were estates that had been sold one by one to pay creditors. There were economies that had been implemented, staff that had been let go, rooms that had been closed off to save on heating and maintenance. Ashcroft Hall, for all its grandeur, was slowly crumbling from within, and its master was powerless to stop it. I saw the evidence of this decline everywhere I looked. The carpets that grew threadbare and were not replaced. The paintings that disappeared from the walls, sold quietly to collectors in London. The gardens that grew wild as the gardeners were dismissed. And I saw it in the Duke himself, in the deepening lines around his eyes and the weight that seemed to press upon his shoulders more heavily with each passing month. He worked tirelessly, I knew, poring over ledgers and meeting with solicitors and bankers, trying to find some way to save his family's legacy. But the debts were too great, the income too small, and the inevitable drew closer with every season. It was in the autumn of my 12th year at Ashcroft Hall that everything finally came to a head. I remember the day precisely because it was the day I learned that the home I loved was to be taken from me. I was polishing the silver in the butler's pantry when Mrs. Clements came to find me, her face pale and drawn in a way I had never seen before. She told me to gather the household staff in the servants' hall, and when we were all assembled, she delivered the news in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to control it. The Duke had been forced to sell Ashcroft Hall. A buyer had been found, a man named Cornelius Blackwood, who had made his fortune in manufacturing and who intended to demolish the manor to build a factory on the land. The sale would be finalized within the fortnight, and we were all to seek new positions elsewhere. The silence that followed her announcement was absolute. I looked around at the faces of my fellow servants, people who had become my family over the years, and I saw my own shock and grief reflected in their eyes. Old Thomas, the butler, who had served the Fitzroy family for 40 years. Young Betsy, the scullery maid, who had arrived just last spring and still jumped at shadows. Mr. Aldridge, the cook, whose roast beef and Yorkshire pudding had been the highlight of every Sunday dinner. All of us were to be scattered to the winds, our little community dissolved as if it had never existed. But it was not my own fate that concerned me most in that moment. It was the thought of the Duke, of Ambrose, being forced to watch as his ancestral home was torn down brick by brick. I knew how much Ashcroft Hall meant to him, despite his complicated relationship with its memories. I knew that losing it would be like losing a part of himself. The fortnight that followed was a blur of packing and sorting, of tearful farewells and practical arrangements. Mrs. Clements helped those of us who needed it to find new positions, and I was fortunate enough to secure a place as a housemaid at a smaller estate in the neighboring county. It was not the same, I knew. Nothing would ever be the same. But I told myself that I should be grateful for the opportunity and tried to ignore the ache in my chest that grew sharper with each passing day. I saw the Duke only once during those final days, and the sight of him broke my heart. He was standing in the great hall, looking up at the portrait of his mother that had hung there for as long as I could remember. His face was expressionless, but his hands were clenched at his sides, and there was a rigidity to his posture that spoke of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. I wanted to go to him, to offer some word of comfort, but what could a servant say to her master in such a moment? What comfort could I possibly provide? So I did what I had always done. I made myself invisible. I slipped past him without a sound and continued on my way to the kitchens, carrying the weight of my unspoken love like a stone in my chest. It was on the final night before the transfer of ownership that everything changed. Most of the staff had already departed, their trunks packed and their goodbyes said. Only a skeleton crew remained to oversee the final details, and I had volunteered to stay until the very end, unable to bear the thought of leaving before I absolutely had to. Mrs. Clements had given me one last task, to clean out the unused rooms in the East Wing that had been closed off for years, to ensure that nothing of value had been left behind. The East Wing was a part of the house I rarely visited. It had been shut up since before my arrival, its doors locked and its windows shuttered against the light. There were rumors among the servants about why it had been abandoned, whispers of tragedy and scandal that no one would speak of directly. All I knew for certain was that it had been the private domain of the late Duchess, and that after her death the old Duke had ordered it sealed as if trying to lock away the memory of his grief. I made my way through the darkened corridors with a candle in one hand and a ring of keys in the other, unlocking doors that had not been opened in decades. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of disuse, and the furniture was draped in white sheets that made the rooms look like they were populated by ghosts. I worked methodically, checking drawers and wardrobes, finding nothing but moth-eaten linens and faded correspondence that crumbled at my touch. It was in the last room, a small sitting room at the far end of the wing, that I made the discovery that would change everything. I had almost finished my search when I noticed something odd about the wall behind the fireplace. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of roses and vines, seemed to bulge slightly in one section, as if something were pressing against it from behind. Curious, I moved closer and ran my fingers along the surface, feeling for any irregularity. And that was when I found it, a seam in the paper, almost invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the touch. My heart began to beat faster as I carefully peeled back the wallpaper, revealing a door hidden beneath. It was small, no more than 4 feet high, and made of heavy oak reinforced with iron bands. There was no handle, only a keyhole, and I tried every key on my ring until at last one fit. The lock turned with a sound like a sigh, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow passage leading down into darkness. I should have stopped there. I should have reported my discovery to Mrs. Clements or the Duke and let someone else investigate. But something compelled me forward, some instinct I could not name, and before I knew it, I was descending the stone steps with my candle held high, leaving the world I knew behind. The passage led to a vault. There is no other word for it. A vast underground chamber with walls of solid stone and a ceiling so high that my candlelight could not reach it. And in that chamber, arranged on shelves and tables and piled in corners, was more wealth than I had ever seen in my life. Gold coins spilled from overturned chests like waterfalls frozen in time. Jewels glittered in the darkness, rubies and emeralds and diamonds catching my candle flame and scattering it into 1,000 points of light. There were paintings stacked against the walls, their gilt frames tarnished but their subjects still visible, portraits of lords and ladies from centuries past. There were documents in leather cases, land deeds and stock certificates, and bonds that meant nothing to me, but that I somehow knew were valuable beyond measure. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The Fitzroy family was not bankrupt. They had never been bankrupt. All this time, while the Duke struggled to pay his debts and sold off his inheritance piece by piece, a fortune beyond imagining had been sitting beneath his feet, forgotten and abandoned. My mind raced as I tried to process the enormity of what I had found. How long had this treasure been here? Who had hidden it? And why? How could something so vast have been forgotten by the very family it was meant to protect? I moved through the vault in a daze, touching the coins and jewels as if to convince myself they were real. The gold was cold beneath my fingers, smooth and heavy with age. The jewels caught my candlelight and threw it back in colors I had no names for, shades of red and green and blue that seemed almost alive. I picked up a necklace, a cascade of diamonds that sparkled like frozen tears, and held it against my chest, feeling its weight, imagining for just a moment what it would be like to be a woman who wore such things. But the fantasy lasted only a moment. I was not that woman. I was a housemaid, standing in a forbidden place, holding a fortune that did not belong to me. And somewhere above, a duke was preparing to lose his home because he did not know that his salvation lay just feet beneath his feet. When I finally recovered my senses, I ran. I ran back up the passage and through the east wing and down the main staircase, not caring about the noise I made or the impropriety of my behavior. I had to find the Duke. I had to tell him what I had discovered before it was too late. I found him in the library, sitting alone in the darkness with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I burst through the door, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in my disheveled appearance and my wild eyes. "What is it?" he asked, rising to his feet. "What has happened?" I could not speak. The words tangled in my throat, too enormous to be contained by mere language. Instead, I seized his hand, an unforgivable breach of propriety that I was too overwhelmed to consider, and I pulled him after me through the house, up the stairs, along the corridors, and into the east wing. He resisted at first, asking questions I could not answer, but something in my desperation must have convinced him to follow. And when we reached the hidden door and descended together into the vault, when his own candle joined mine in illuminating the impossible treasure before us, I watched his face transform from confusion to disbelief to something I can only describe as shattering. He did not speak. He simply stood there, staring at the wealth that surrounded us, and then his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. I caught him as he fell, my arms barely strong enough to slow his descent, and I lowered him gently to the cold stone floor. His face was pale as marble in the candlelight, and for one terrible moment I feared that the shock had stopped his heart entirely. But no. His chest rose and fell with breath, and after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, his eyes fluttered open and met mine. "Tell me I am not dreaming," he whispered. "You are not dreaming," I replied, and my voice broke on the words. "Your Grace, you are saved." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. I helped the Duke back to the main house, where we found Lady Dorothea waiting in the drawing room, unable to sleep on what she had believed to be the last night of her family's residence at Ashcroft Hall. When Ambrose told her what I had discovered, her face went through the same progression of emotions I had witnessed in him: shock and disbelief, and overwhelming relief. But unlike her nephew, she did not faint. Instead, she sat down heavily in the nearest chair and began to laugh, a sound that started soft and grew until it filled the room, tears streaming down her cheeks as she surrendered to the absurdity of it all. We spent the rest of the night examining the contents of the vault, cataloging what we could, and speculating about the rest. Lady Dorothea, it emerged, had heard rumors as a young woman of a secret Fitzroy treasure, but she had always believed them to be nothing more than family legend. The vault, she suspected, had been created by the third Duke during the Civil War, a hiding place for the family's wealth in case the monarchy fell and their lands were seized. But the third Duke had died suddenly before he could tell anyone of its existence, and the secret had been lost for 200 years. It was dawn by the time we had finished our preliminary survey, and by then, the full implications of the discovery had begun to sink in. The treasure in the vault was worth millions, tens of millions, perhaps even more. Enough to pay off every debt the family had ever accumulated. Enough to restore Ashcroft Hall to its former glory. Enough to ensure that Ambrose and his descendants would never want for anything again. But there was a complication, one that none of us had considered in the initial excitement. The sale of Ashcroft Hall had already been agreed upon. The contracts had been signed just the day before. Legally, the estate now belonged to Cornelius Blackwood, and everything in it belonged to him as well, including the vault and its contents. The Duke's face, which had been almost boyish with relief and hope, hardened at this realization. He called for his solicitor, a nervous man named Mr. Whitfield, who arrived within the hour, still adjusting his spectacles and smoothing his rumpled coat. The conversation that followed was long and complicated, filled with legal terminology I did not understand. But the essence of it was this. The sale could potentially be contested on the grounds that both parties had been operating under a material misapprehension about the value of the property. The treasure, being unknown to either party at the time of the agreement, might constitute grounds for voiding the contract entirely. But it would not be simple, Mr. Whitfield warned. Blackwood would certainly fight any attempt to undo the sale, and the matter would likely end up in court. It could take months, even years, to resolve, and there was no guarantee of success. "I will fight it," Ambrose said, his voice steady and sure in a way I had never heard before. "I will fight it for as long as it takes. This is my family's home, and I will not surrender it without a battle." And so the battle began. Cornelius Blackwood arrived at Ashcroft Hall the very next morning, expecting to take possession of his newly acquired property. He was a short, stout man in his 50s, with thinning hair pomaded flat against his skull and small eyes that gleamed with the satisfaction of a bargain well made. He had made his fortune in the textile industry, buying failing mills for a pittance and working their employees to exhaustion to squeeze out every last penny of profit. The purchase of Ashcroft Hall was, for him, merely the latest in a long line of acquisitions, a grand estate to demolish and replace with something more productive. His satisfaction curdled into fury when the Duke informed him of the discovery and the intention to contest the sale. I was not present for the conversation, but I heard it through the door, as did half the remaining servants. Blackwood's voice rose to a shout as he accused the Duke of fraud, of hiding the treasure deliberately to trick him into an unfavorable bargain. He threatened lawsuits and ruin and worse, his words dripping with venom and wounded pride. The Duke remained calm throughout the tirade, at least outwardly. When Blackwood finally paused for breath, Ambrose replied in a voice as cold and sharp as winter ice that he had known nothing of the vault's existence until the previous night, that the discovery was as much a surprise to him as it was to anyone, and that the matter would be decided by the courts according to the law. Until then, he said, Blackwood was not welcome at Ashcroft Hall. The door slammed so hard when Blackwood left that a portrait fell from the wall in the adjacent corridor. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn into events that I never could have anticipated. The Duke required a full inventory of the vault's contents, and I, having been the one to discover it, was asked to assist in the effort. It was highly irregular, a housemaid being given such a responsibility, but these were highly irregular circumstances, and there was no one else available who could be trusted with the task. The remaining senior servants had already departed for new positions, and new staff could not be hired until the legal situation was resolved. And so I spent my days in the vault, surrounded by treasure, carefully recording each item in a leather-bound ledger while the Duke and Lady Dorothea worked beside me. It was strange, being in such close proximity to them, being treated almost as an equal rather than as a servant. Lady Dorothea began to address me by my Christian name, something she had never done before, and she asked me questions about myself with what seemed like genuine interest. The Duke, too, seemed to see me differently now. He would sometimes pause in his work to watch me, a thoughtful expression on his face, and when our eyes met, he would look away quickly as if caught in some private contemplation. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that the unusual circumstances had simply blurred the normal boundaries between master and servant, and that once the legal matters were settled, everything would return to the way it had been before. But even as I thought these things, I could feel something shifting between us, some invisible barrier growing thinner with each passing day. It was during the third week of our inventory work that the Duke finally spoke to me about something other than the task at hand. We were alone in the vault that afternoon, Lady Dorothea having retired to rest after a morning of cataloguing jewelry. I was seated at a small table recording the details of a collection of antique coins when I became aware of him standing behind me. I turned, expecting a question about my progress, and found him looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Flora," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice was like nothing I had ever heard before. I have been trying to find the words, and I find that I cannot. You have given my family a miracle. You have given me back my home, my legacy, my future, and I do not know how to thank you. I shook my head, uncomfortable with the praise. I did nothing but stumble upon a hidden door, Your Grace. The miracle was already there. I merely found it. You found it because you cared, he replied. You stayed when everyone else had left. You worked to the very end, in rooms that had been abandoned for decades, because you could not bear to leave anything undone. Another servant might have ignored that bulge in the wallpaper. Another servant might have reported the door and thought no more of it. But you, Flora, you followed your instincts, and in doing so, you saved everything. I did not know how to respond. My heart was beating so fast that I was certain he must be able to hear it, and my face burned with a flush I could not control. I looked down at my hands, at the ink stains on my fingers from the ledger, and I tried to remember how to breathe. I have watched you, he continued, his voice softer now. For years, I have watched you moving through this house like a shadow, always present but never seen. I am ashamed to admit that I did not even know your name until a month ago, but I know it now, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about you. Your Grace, I whispered, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. You must not say such things. Why must I not, he asked. Because you are a servant and I am a duke. Because society would disapprove. I have spent my entire life doing what society expected of me, Flora. I have been cold when I wanted to be warm. I have been distant when I longed for connection. I have watched my family's fortune crumble while I followed every rule and convention that was supposed to protect it. And what good did any of it do? He moved closer, close enough that I could have touched him if I dared. I am not asking for anything, he said. I am not demanding or expecting. I am simply telling you the truth, because I have learned that life is too short and too uncertain for anything less. You have captured my attention, Flora Pemberton. You have made me see things I was blind to before. And whatever happens with Blackwood, whatever the future holds, I wanted you to know. I looked up at him then. At this man I had loved silently for so many years, and I saw that his eyes were bright with emotion, that his hands were trembling slightly at his sides. He was as nervous as I was, I realized. This powerful duke, this master of Ashcroft Hall, was as terrified of my response as I was of his words. I did not know what to say. So I said nothing. I simply reached out and took his hand in mine, and I held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. We stood like that for a long moment, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to, And in that silence, I felt something settle into place within me, some piece of my heart that had been wandering for 12 years finally finding its home. The days that followed were unlike anything I had experienced before. Nothing had been declared, nothing had been promised, and yet everything was different. The Duke and I continued our work in the vault, but now there were stolen glances and accidental touches, conversations that wandered from inventory reports to favorite books to childhood memories. I learned that he had always wanted to travel to Italy, but had never had the chance. He learned that I had taught myself to read from books I found in the servants' hall, and that I secretly wrote poetry on scraps of paper that I hid beneath my mattress. We discovered that we both loved thunderstorms and hated fish, and believed that the best hour of the day was that quiet time just before dawn, when the world seemed full of possibility. Lady Dorothea observed these developments with an expression that I could not quite decipher. She said nothing directly, but sometimes I caught her watching us with a small smile playing at the corners of her lips, as if she knew a secret that we had not yet discovered ourselves. Meanwhile, the legal battle with Cornelius Blackwood intensified. True to his word, Blackwood had filed suit against the Duke, claiming breach of contract and fraud. The newspapers had gotten wind of the story, and soon all of England seemed to be talking about the mysterious treasure of Ashcroft Hall. Reporters appeared at the gates, begging for interviews. Society matrons sent letters expressing their support, their curiosity, or their disapproval. And through it all, the Duke maintained his composure, meeting with solicitors and barristers, preparing for the court case that would determine his fate. It was during this tumultuous period that Lady Dorothea called me to her private sitting room for a conversation that would reveal secrets I had never imagined. She was seated by the window when I arrived, her silver hair glowing in the afternoon light, her hands folded in her lap with unusual stillness. She gestured for me to sit, and when I had done so, she regarded me for a long moment before speaking. "I suppose you are wondering," she said, "why my brother sealed the east wing after his wife died." The question surprised me. I had wondered, of course, as had all the servants over the years, but I had never expected to be given an answer. "The Duchess," Lady Dorothea continued, "was not a happy woman. Oh, she loved Reginald in her way, and she adored Ambrose more than life itself. But she carried a burden of guilt that she could never set down, a secret that she kept even from her husband." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. You see, the Duchess was the one who knew about the vault. She had discovered it as a young bride, exploring the house in those first giddy months of marriage. But she told no one. She kept the secret to herself, intending to reveal it someday when the time was right. And then the years passed, and the time was never right. And gradually the secret became a weight she could not bear. I listened in silence, not daring to interrupt. She was afraid, Lady Dorothea said simply. Afraid of what her husband would think of her for keeping such a thing hidden. Afraid that the wealth would change them, corrupt them, destroy the simple happiness they had built together. And so she said nothing, and the secret ate away at her from within. By the end, I believe it contributed to her illness. Guilt can do that, you know. It can poison the body as surely as any toxin. She was quiet for a moment, her expression sad. When she died, she tried to tell Reginald about the vault. She whispered something to him on her deathbed, something about the east wing, about a hidden door. But he was too consumed by grief to understand. He thought she was delirious, rambling about nothing. And afterward, he could not bear to enter that part of the house, because it reminded him too much of her. So he sealed it up, and the secret was lost once more. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Lady Dorothea smiled, but there was sorrow in it. "Because I want you to understand something, Flora. Secrets are dangerous things. They may seem small when we first create them, but they grow in the darkness, becoming larger and more terrible with every passing year. The Duchess loved her family, but her secret nearly destroyed them. If you had not found that vault, everything would have been lost, not because the treasure did not exist, but because one woman was too afraid to speak the truth. She leaned forward, her pale eyes holding mine. "My nephew cares for you. I have seen it in the way he looks at you, the way he speaks your name. And I believe you care for him as well. But there will be obstacles, Flora. There will be people who say that a match between a duke and a housemaid is impossible, improper, unthinkable. There will be pressure to hide your feelings, to pretend they do not exist, to create secrets of your own. I am telling you now," she said, her voice firm and clear, "do not do it. Do not let fear make you into the Duchess. If you love my nephew, love him openly and let the world think what it will. That is the only path to happiness. I have lived long enough to know that much at least." I left Lady Dorothea's sitting room with my mind reeling and my heart full. Her words had given me courage, had shown me that the impossible might not be as impossible as I had believed. But there were still so many uncertainties. The lawsuit, the scandal, the vast gulf of class and circumstance that separated me from the man I loved. I did not know if we could bridge that gulf or if we should even try. The court case against Cornelius Blackwood began on a gray morning in late November, nearly 2 months after my discovery of the vault. The Duke traveled to London for the proceedings, accompanied by Lady Dorothea and, to the shock of everyone who knew them, by me. Ambrose had insisted that I be present as a witness since I was the one who had found the treasure, and no argument could dissuade him. I had never been to London before, and under other circumstances, I might have been overwhelmed by the noise and bustle, the crowded streets and towering buildings, the sheer humanity pressed together in every direction. But I was too nervous to appreciate any of it. The outcome of this trial would determine not only the fate of Ashcroft Hall, but the fate of my own fragile hopes and dreams. The courtroom was packed with spectators when we arrived. Journalists and society figures and curious onlookers who had come to witness the drama firsthand. I sat in the gallery with Lady Dorothea while the Duke took his place at the front, flanked by his legal team. And across the room, his face twisted with barely suppressed rage, sat Cornelius Blackwood. The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses were called, documents were presented, and lawyers argued their cases with passion and precision. I testified on the second day, describing my discovery of the hidden door and the vault beyond, and though my voice trembled and my hands shook, I managed to tell my story clearly and completely. Blackwood's lawyer tried to suggest that I had been instructed to search for the treasure, that the Duke had known of its existence all along, but I held firm to the truth, and eventually he gave up his line of questioning. On the final day, the judge delivered his verdict. The sale of Ashcroft Hall, he declared, had been entered into by both parties under a material misapprehension regarding the value of the property. Since neither the buyer nor the seller had known of the treasure's existence at the time of the agreement, the contract could not be considered valid. The sale was voided, and Ashcroft Hall was to be returned to its rightful owner, Lord Ambrose Fitzroy, Duke of Ashcroft. The courtroom erupted in noise, cheers, and protests, and the scratch of 100 pens as journalists rushed to record the decision. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to process what I had just heard. It was over. The Duke had won. Ashcroft Hall was saved. I looked across the room and found Ambrose looking back at me. His face was pale with relief, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The message in his gaze was clear enough. We had won together. The return to Ashcroft Hall was triumphant. Word of the verdict had spread quickly, and by the time our carriage reached the village at the edge of the estate, a crowd had gathered to welcome us home. They cheered as we passed, throwing flowers and waving handkerchiefs, and though I knew their celebration was for the Duke and not for me, I could not help but feel a part of it. In the days that followed, life at Ashcroft Hall began to transform. The treasure from the vault was properly assessed and secured, and arrangements were made to sell some of the less significant pieces to pay off the family's debts once and for all. New staff were hired to replace those who had departed, and plans were drawn up for the restoration of the neglected areas of the house. For the first time in decades, Ashcroft Hall hummed with energy and hope. But amidst all this activity, one matter remained unresolved. The Duke had been unfailingly kind to me since our return, but he had not repeated his declaration from the vault. I told myself that he was simply busy, overwhelmed by the demands of his newly secure position. But a small, fearful part of me wondered if his feelings had changed, if the strange intensity of those uncertain days had faded now that the crisis was past. It was Lady Dorothea who finally forced the issue. She found me one afternoon in the library, where I had retreated with a book to escape my own churning thoughts. Without preamble, she sat down across from me and fixed me with her penetrating gaze. "My nephew is an idiot," she announced. I blinked at her, too surprised to respond. "He has been moping about for weeks," she continued, sighing and staring out of windows like a character in a bad novel. "He is in love with you, Flora, and he is too frightened to do anything about it. He thinks you deserve better than a scandal, better than being whispered about by every gossip in England. He thinks he should let you go, find some respectable position far away from here, where you can build a life untainted by association with him." My heart clenched painfully in my chest. "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think," Lady Dorothea said slowly, "that you should go to him and tell him exactly what you want. I think you should stop waiting for him to be brave and be brave yourself. And I think you should do it right now, because he is alone in the conservatory, and I have arranged for you not to be disturbed." She stood, brushed off her skirts, and walked to the door. But before she left, she turned back and gave me a smile that was almost mischievous. "Life is too short for secrets, Flora," she said. "I should have thought you had learned that by now." The conservatory was warm and fragrant, with the scent of exotic flowers, a glass-walled paradise that the late Duchess had created and that had somehow survived the years of neglect. The Duke stood with his back to me, gazing out at the gathering dusk, and he did not turn when I entered. "Your aunt tells me you have been an idiot," I said. He laughed, a short, surprised sound that broke the tension. "She told me the same thing not an hour ago. She seems determined to manage both of our lives, whether we wish it or not." "Perhaps someone needs to," I replied, "since we seem incapable of managing them ourselves." He turned then, and I saw the conflict in his face, the hope and fear and longing all tangled together. "Flora," he began, but I did not let him finish. "I know what you are going to say," I told him. "You are going to tell me that I deserve better than a life of scandal and whispers. You are going to tell me that you cannot ask me to sacrifice my reputation for your sake. You are going to be noble and selfless and utterly, completely wrong." I stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his amber eyes. "I have spent 12 years in this house," I said. "I have loved you for at least half that time, though I never dared to admit it, even to myself. I have watched you from a distance, learned your moods and your habits, your kindnesses and your sorrows. And in all that time, I never once dreamed that you might love me in return." "You love me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you," I confirmed, "and I do not care what society thinks. I do not care about scandal or whispers or the opinions of people who have never known a moment of real hardship in their lives. I care about you, Ambrose. Only you. And if you send me away out of some misguided notion of nobility, I will never forgive you." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. And then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features into something bright and joyful and achingly beautiful. "I would never forgive myself either," he said, and he took me in his arms and kissed me. The scandal, when it came, was everything Lady Dorothea had predicted and nothing we had not prepared for. The newspapers devoted pages to the story of the Duke and the housemaid, painting it as either a romance for the ages or a disgraceful breach of social propriety, depending on the publication. Society matrons whispered and snickered. Invitations to fashionable events dried up almost overnight. And Cornelius Blackwood, still smarting from his legal defeat, seized upon the affair as evidence of the Duke's moral unfitness, spreading rumors and insinuations wherever he could. But none of it mattered. Or rather, it mattered, but not in the way it might once have done. The Duke and I faced the storm together, our love a shelter against the winds of disapproval. Lady Dorothea stood with us, her formidable reputation serving as a shield against the worst of the attacks. And gradually, as the weeks turned into months and it became clear that our attachment was sincere and enduring, the scandal began to fade. It helped, I think, that the Duke used his newly restored fortune not for idle pleasures, but for the betterment of his tenants and the surrounding community. He built a school in the village, endowed a hospital, improved the roads and housing on his estates. He became known not as the Duke who had married beneath him, but as the Duke who had a heart for the common people. And I, far from being a shameful secret, became a symbol of that heart. We were married in the spring, in the little chapel on the Ashcroft Hall grounds where generations of Fitzroys had been wed before us. It was not a grand society wedding. There were no titled guests or elaborate celebrations. But there were flowers everywhere, spilling from every vase and window box, and there was sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, painting us in colors of gold and rose. And there was love, so much love that I thought my heart might burst from the abundance of it. Lady Dorothea gave me away, since I had no family of my own to perform the duty. She walked me down the aisle with her chin held high and her eyes suspiciously bright, and when she placed my hand in Ambrose's, she whispered something in my ear that I have never forgotten. "You have given this family a second chance," she said. "Never let anyone make you feel unworthy of that." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were always those who looked down upon me, who whispered that I had risen above my station, who predicted that our marriage would end in disaster. But I learned to let such whispers wash over me like water off a duck's back. I had found something rare and precious, a love that transcended the boundaries of class and convention, a partner who saw me as I truly was and cherished me all the more for it. We restored Ashcroft Hall to its full glory, not as a monument to aristocratic excess, but as a living home filled with warmth and laughter and purpose. We opened the gardens to the public on summer weekends, allowing villagers and visitors to enjoy the beauty that had once been hidden behind walls. We turned the East Wing, where I had discovered the vault, into a gallery showcasing the art and artifacts that the treasure had contained, sharing the history of the Fitzroy family with anyone who cared to learn it. And we found, in each other, a happiness that neither of us had dared to hope for. I am writing this now from the window seat in the library, the same library where I once crept like a shadow, afraid to be seen or heard. Outside, the autumn sun is setting over the moors, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that remind me of my husband's eyes. In the distance, I can hear his voice, laughing at something Lady Dorothea has said, and the sound fills me with a warmth that has not dimmed in all the years we have been together. I discovered £70 million behind a crumbling wall, and in doing so, I discovered so much more. I discovered that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that the walls we build between ourselves and others can be torn down if we have the strength to try. I discovered that a housemaid can become a duchess, that a cold and distant man can learn to feel again, that a family on the brink of ruin can be reborn into something stronger and better than before. But most of all, I discovered that the true treasure of Ashcroft Hall was never the gold or the jewels or the paintings hidden in that underground vault. The true treasure was the love that we found there, in the darkness, waiting to be brought into the light, and that treasure I know will last forever. I think often of those early days after the discovery, when everything was chaos and uncertainty and breathless hope. There are moments that stand out in my memory like paintings in a gallery, each one a testament to the journey we took together. I remember the morning after we first descended into the vault when the Duke called together what remained of the household staff to explain what had happened. We gathered in the servants' hall, the same room where Mrs. Clements had delivered the devastating news of the sale just weeks before. But this time, the atmosphere was different, charged with confusion and cautious hope, rather than despair. Ambrose stood at the head of the long table, looking more uncertain than I had ever seen him. He was not accustomed to addressing servants directly, to standing among us rather than above us. But he did it anyway, his voice steady even as his hands gripped the back of a chair for support. He told them everything. The discovery of the vault, the treasure within, the intention to contest the sale. And he told them something else, something that made my heart swell with admiration and love. He told them that regardless of what happened with the legal case, regardless of whether the estate was saved or lost, he would ensure that every member of the staff found good positions. He would write letters of recommendation himself. He would use whatever influence he had to see them settled. No one would be abandoned. No one would be left to face an uncertain future alone. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Old Thomas, the butler, who had been with the family since before Ambrose was born, actually wept. The other servants murmured among themselves, their expressions shifting from shock to relief to something approaching devotion. In that moment, I saw the man Ambrose truly was beneath the cold exterior he had cultivated for so long. He was a leader, a protector, a man who understood that nobility meant something more than a title. And I loved him all the more for it. The days that followed were filled with activity and anxiety in equal measure. Mr. Whitfield, the solicitor, took up residence in one of the guest rooms, working around the clock to prepare the legal case against Blackwood. Messengers came and went at all hours, carrying documents and correspondence. The house, which had been so quiet and subdued in those final weeks before the sale, suddenly hummed with energy and purpose. I threw myself into the work of cataloging the vault's contents, grateful for something to occupy my hands and my mind. The task was enormous. Every item had to be examined, described, and recorded. Every coin had to be counted, every jewel assessed, every document translated and analyzed. It would take months to complete a full inventory, but we needed at least a preliminary accounting for the court case, evidence that the treasure existed and that its value far exceeded the £5 Blackwood had paid for the estate. Lady Dorothea worked alongside me, and I came to know her better in those weeks than I had in all my years of service. She was not the cold, forbidding woman I had always believed her to be. She was sharp and witty and deeply intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that revealed itself in unexpected moments. She told me stories of her youth, of balls and suitors, and the husband she had loved and lost. She asked me about my own life, my childhood, my dreams, listening with an attention that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. It was Lady Dorothea who first noticed the change between Ambrose and me. We thought we were being discreet, stealing glances when we thought no one was watching, allowing our hands to brush when we passed documents back and forth. But nothing escaped her keen eyes. "You care for him?" she said one afternoon, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. We were alone in the vault, sorting through a collection of antique maps, and her words caught me so off guard that I nearly dropped the priceless document in my hands. "I beg your pardon, my lady," I stammered, feeling the blood rush to my face. She looked at me with something that might have been amusement. "Do not insult my intelligence, Flora. I have been watching the two of you for weeks. The way you look at each other when you think no one is paying attention. The way he says your name, as if it were a prayer. The way you blush whenever he enters a room. I did not know how to respond. Denial seemed pointless, but admission felt dangerous. I stood frozen, caught between fear and hope, waiting for the censure I was certain would come. But Lady Dorothea only sighed. "I am not going to lecture you about propriety," she said. "God knows I have had enough of propriety to last several lifetimes. I am simply going to tell you to be careful. Not because I disapprove, but because I have seen what happens when hearts are given carelessly. My nephew has been hurt before, more deeply than you might imagine. He closed himself off from the world to protect himself from further pain. If you are not serious about this, if you are simply dazzled by the romance of the situation, please walk away now, before you damage him beyond repair." I met her eyes, and I spoke the truth that I had been hiding even from myself. "I am not dazzled, my lady. I have loved him for years, from a distance, without hope. I never expected him to notice me, never imagined that he might return my feelings. But now that I know he does, I cannot pretend otherwise. I would rather face whatever consequences come than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." She studied me for a long moment, her pale eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. And then, slowly, she smiled. "Good," she said. "Then I shall not stand in your way. But know this, Flora Pemberton. If you hurt my nephew, if you break his heart after all the progress he has made, I will make your life extremely unpleasant." I believed her. And somehow, that made me respect her all the more. The weeks leading up to the trial were among the most difficult of my life. The uncertainty was unbearable, a constant weight pressing down on every moment. We worked and we waited. We hoped and we feared. We tried to carry on as if the future were not hanging by a thread. Cornelius Blackwood did not make things easy. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and the prospect of losing Ashcroft Hall had driven him to extremes. He planted stories in the newspapers, suggesting that the Duke had known about the treasure all along and had deliberately concealed it to defraud him. He sent threatening letters, hinting at dark consequences if the legal case was not dropped. He even attempted to have the vault seized as evidence, claiming that its contents rightfully belonged to him. The Duke faced each of these attacks with a calm determination that I found remarkable. He never lost his temper, never responded to provocation with anger. He simply marshaled his resources, consulted with his lawyers, and waited for his day in court. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. The lines around his eyes deepened. He slept poorly, often pacing the halls late into the night. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his mask of composure would slip, revealing the exhausted and frightened man beneath. I tried to comfort him as best I could. We had not yet spoken openly of our feelings, not since that moment in the vault when he had confessed his interest and I had been too overwhelmed to respond. But we had developed a silent language of support, a glance that said, "I am here," a touch that said, "You are not alone." It was not enough, perhaps, but it was something. The trial itself was a spectacle. The newspapers had whipped the public into a frenzy of interest, and people had traveled from all over England to witness the proceedings. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with crowds spilling out into the hallway and onto the street beyond. I sat in the gallery, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, watching as the future of everything I loved hung in the balance. The lawyers argued for hours, their voices rising and falling in a complex dance of rhetoric and evidence. Blackwood's team painted the Duke as a scheming aristocrat, willing to lie and cheat to hold on to his crumbling estate. Our lawyers countered with evidence of the Duke's good faith, testimony from servants and solicitors about the genuine surprise with which he had greeted the discovery. Back and forth they went, claim and counterclaim, until my head ached from trying to follow the threads of argument. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that trembled beneath my skirts. I could feel every eye in the room upon me, judging and evaluating, wondering what this simple housemaid could possibly have to contribute to such weighty proceedings. But I had told the truth my entire life, and I told it now, describing in clear, simple terms how I had come to discover the hidden door and the vault beyond. Blackwood's lawyer tried to rattle me. He suggested that I had been instructed to search for the treasure, that I had been rewarded with promises of advancement for my role in the deception. He sneered at my humble origins, implied that my word was worth less than that of gentlemen and scholars. But I held firm. I had nothing to hide, and I would not be shamed into silence by a man who valued money above truth. When the judge finally delivered his verdict, I felt as if the world had stopped spinning. The words echoed through the courtroom, through my mind, through every fiber of my being. The sale was voided. Ashcroft Hall was saved. I do not remember leaving the courtroom. I do not remember the journey back to our lodgings, or the conversations that followed, or the preparations for our return to Yorkshire. I remember only the moment when Ambrose found me alone in the parlor of our rented house, when he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled me into his arms, when he held me so tightly that I could feel his heart beating against my own. "We won," he whispered against my hair. "Flora, we won." And I wept. I wept for the fear that was finally releasing its grip on my heart. I wept for the future that had seemed impossible and was now spreading before us like a field of flowers. I wept for the girl I had been and the woman I was becoming and the man who held me as if I were the most precious thing in all the world. That night, alone in my room, I allowed myself to dream. I imagined a future where I was not just a servant, where the love I felt was returned and honored, where the barriers between us crumbled like the wall that had hidden the vault. It seemed impossible, fantastical, the fever dream of a foolish girl. But the discovery of the treasure had been impossible too, and yet it had happened. Perhaps, I thought, the world held more possibilities than I had ever dared to believe. The return to Ashcroft Hall was everything I had hoped for and more. The village turned out to greet us, cheering and waving as our carriage rolled past. The servants who had remained or returned gathered on the steps to welcome us home, and the house itself seemed to glow with renewed life, its windows catching the afternoon sun like the eyes of an old friend awakening from a long sleep. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Ambrose transformed. The cold, distant man I had known for so many years began to thaw, revealing warmth and humor I had only glimpsed before. He smiled more often. He laughed at Lady Dorothea's barbed remarks instead of bristling at them. He took long walks through the gardens, something he had not done since his youth, and he sometimes invited me to join him. It was during one of these walks that he finally spoke of his mother. We were in the rose garden, the same garden she had tended with her own hands, and the autumn blooms were fading but still beautiful in the golden afternoon light. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice soft with memory. "She had a gift for seeing people as they truly were, not as their stations demanded they appear. She would have seen your spirit, your strength, your intelligence, and she would have loved you for it." I was moved beyond words by this confidence. I knew how rarely he spoke of the Duchess, how much pain her memory still caused him. "I wish I could have known her," I said. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. She was extraordinary, kind and fierce and impossibly wise. When she died, I felt as if the sun had been extinguished. I could not understand why the world continued turning when she was no longer in it, and I could not forgive my father for continuing to breathe when she could not. He paused, staring at a rose bush that had grown wild and tangled with neglect. "I have been so angry for so long," he continued, "angry at my father for failing to save her, angry at the world for taking her away, angry at myself for every moment I wasted, every visit I did not make, every letter I did not write. The anger became a wall between me and everyone else. I thought it was protecting me, but really, it was just keeping me imprisoned." "What changed?" I asked. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "You did," he said simply. "You and your impossible discovery. You reminded me that miracles can happen, that walls can come down, that there is always hope, even when everything seems lost. I have spent years believing that I was beyond salvation. But when I look at you, Flora, I begin to think that perhaps I was wrong. I did not know how to respond to such words. I was just a housemaid, a woman of no consequence, who had stumbled upon a hidden door by accident. I had not set out to change anyone, had not imagined that I could. But looking at Ambrose in that garden, seeing the healing that had begun in his wounded heart, I realized that perhaps we do not always have to intend to make a difference. Sometimes, simply being who we are is enough. Our courtship, if it could be called that, was unconventional to say the least. There were no formal introductions, no chaperoned visits, no exchange of calling cards between families. There was simply the growing understanding between us, deepening day by day, as we worked together and walked together and slowly, carefully, revealed ourselves to each other. Lady Dorothea watched our progress with an expression that hovered somewhere between approval and exasperation. She thought we were moving too slowly, I knew. She wanted declarations and commitments, clear statements of intention. But we were both too cautious for that, too aware of the obstacles that lay ahead, too afraid of shattering the fragile thing we were building. It was the conversation with Lady Dorothea about secrets that finally gave me the courage to act. Her words haunted me in the days that followed, forcing me to examine my own fears and hesitations. Was I not creating a secret of my own, concealing the depth of my feelings to protect myself from rejection? Was I not doing exactly what the Duchess had done, letting fear prevent me from speaking the truth? I thought of all the years I had spent watching Ambrose from a distance, loving him in silence, never daring to hope. I thought of how close we had come to losing everything, how easily the treasure might have remained hidden, how different the outcome might have been if I had ignored that bulge in the wallpaper. Life was fragile, I realized, and full of chance. To waste a single moment on fear seemed suddenly like the greatest foolishness imaginable. And so I went to him in the conservatory, my heart pounding with terror and hope in equal measure. And I spoke the words I had carried inside me for so long. The memory of that conversation, of his smile, of his kiss, still makes my pulse quicken even now. It was the moment when everything changed, when the impossible became possible, when the future opened before us like a door long locked and finally released. But the path from that kiss to the altar was not without its thorns. The announcement of our engagement sent shockwaves through society that I had naively underestimated. The newspapers that had celebrated the Duke's legal victory now turned their attention to his choice of bride, and their coverage ranged from prurient fascination to outright condemnation. I remember the first time I saw myself described in print. A gossip column in one of the London papers had devoted an entire paragraph to dissecting my unsuitability, cataloging my humble origins, my lack of education, my presumption in daring to aspire above my station. The words burned like acid, each one a reminder that no matter how much Ambrose loved me, the world would never see me as his equal. It was Lady Dorothea who found me weeping in the library that afternoon, the newspaper crumpled in my fist. She did not ask what had happened. She simply took the paper from my hand, read the offending passage, and then, to my astonishment, laughed. "Is that the worst they can say?" she asked. "That you are poor and common and unschooled? Flora, my dear, if that is the extent of their ammunition, you have nothing to fear. Society has short memory and even shorter attention. Give them a few months, and they will find some new scandal to occupy their vicious little minds." "But what if they never accept me?" I asked. "What if I spend the rest of my life as an outsider, tolerated but never welcomed?" Lady Dorothea sat down beside me and took my hands in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. "Let me tell you something about society," she said. "It is a collection of frightened people who have convinced themselves that their position is earned rather than inherited. They cling to their rules and their hierarchies because without them, they would have to face the uncomfortable truth that they are no better than anyone else. You threaten them, Flora? You, with your intelligence and your courage and your refusal to be invisible. You are proof that the categories they have created are not as solid as they pretend." She squeezed my hands. "Some of them will never accept you. Some of them will always whisper and sneer and find ways to exclude you from their precious circles. But you know what? Those people do not matter. What matters is that you have found a man who loves you, a home that welcomes you, a future that belongs to you. The rest is noise." I wiped my eyes, feeling foolish for my tears. "How did you become so wise?" I asked. She smiled. "I made every mistake it is possible to make, and then I lived long enough to learn from them. Now, stop crying and come help me choose flowers for the wedding. I refuse to have wilting blooms at my nephew's nuptials. It would be unforgivable." The wedding preparations provided a welcome distraction from the whispers and stares. Lady Dorothea threw herself into the planning with an energy that belied her years, consulting with florists and seamstresses, debating the merits of various menus, arguing with the vicar about the order of hymns. She was in her element, I realized, organizing and commanding and making decisions. It was what she had been born to do, and the opportunity to do it again, after so many years of quiet retirement, seemed to rejuvenate her. I was fitted for a wedding dress, an experience that left me feeling like an imposter playing at being a lady. The seamstress was a quiet woman from the village who had sewn clothing for the Fitzroy family for 3 generations, and she handled the expensive silk and lace with a reverence that made me uncomfortable. "This is not who I am," I wanted to say. I should be the one serving tea, not the one being measured for finery, but I did not say it. I stood still and let myself be draped and pinned and adjusted, and I tried to imagine what it would feel like to be Flora Fitzroy, Duchess of Ashcroft. The title seemed impossible, like a costume I was not permitted to wear. And yet, if I closed my eyes and thought of Ambrose, of his smile and his touch and the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world, the impossibility began to soften. Perhaps I could grow into the role, I thought. Perhaps it was not about being something I was not, but about becoming something I had always had the potential to be. Ambrose, for his part, seemed utterly unconcerned with the opinions of society. When I mentioned the gossip columns, the whispers, the disapproving looks we received on our rare trips into town, he simply shrugged and said that the opinions of strangers meant nothing to him. What mattered was what we thought of each other, what we built together, the life we were creating within the walls of Ashcroft Hall. But I noticed that he kept me sheltered from the worst of the criticism. He screened the mail, I realized later, removing the poison pen letters before I could see them. He declined invitations to social events where he knew I would be snubbed or humiliated. He surrounded me with people who cared for me, Lady Dorothea and the servants who had become my friends, creating a bubble of warmth and acceptance that kept the cold world at bay. It was a kindness I did not fully appreciate until years later, when I learned just how vicious some of those letters had been, just how determined some of society's matriarchs had been to prevent our marriage. Ambrose had fought battles on my behalf that I never knew about, had protected me from wounds that would have devastated me. And he had done it without fanfare, without seeking gratitude, simply because he loved me. That is the kind of man he was. That is the kind of man he remains. The wedding day arrived on a morning so beautiful it seemed designed by Providence specifically for us. The sun rose golden over the moors, the sky was the pale blue of a robin's egg, and the air was soft with the promise of spring. I woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and watched the light slowly fill my room with color and warmth. I thought of my parents as I dressed, wondering what they would make of their daughter's impossible journey. My father, who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide for our family. My mother, who had dreamed of a better life for me even as illness stole away her own. They had wanted me to be happy, I knew. They had wanted me to find love and purpose and a place in the world where I belonged. And now, after all these years, I had found all of those things. "I wish you could see me now," I whispered to the empty room. I wish you could know that I am going to be all right." The ceremony itself was a blur of music and flowers and the feel of Ambrose's hand clasping mine. I remember the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, painting us in colors of gold and rose. I remember the sound of Lady Dorothea weeping, not with sorrow, but with joy. I remember the moment when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, when Ambrose lifted my veil and looked at me with an expression of such tenderness that I thought my heart would burst. And I remember the kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise, the first kiss of our new life together. Afterward, there was a celebration in the great hall, with music and feasting and dancing that lasted until the stars came out. The tenants and villagers had been invited along with the handful of aristocratic friends who had remained loyal despite the scandal, and the mix of classes and backgrounds created an atmosphere that was unlike any society event I had ever witnessed. There was laughter everywhere, genuine and unforced, and when Ambrose led me onto the dance floor for our first waltz, I felt as if I were floating above the ground. This is real, I thought. This is my life now. This extraordinary, impossible, wonderful life. The years that followed proved Lady Dorothea right about society's short memory. Within a year, the scandal of the Duke's marriage had faded from the gossip columns, replaced by fresher outrages and newer fascinations. Within 2 years, I had been grudgingly accepted into the circles that had once rejected me, invited to teas and balls and charity events by women who had sworn they would never acknowledge me. Within 5 years, I had become something of a celebrity, the housemaid who married a duke, the rags to riches story that everyone wanted to hear. I never forgot where I came from. I never stopped noticing the servants who moved invisibly through the grand houses I now visited, never stopped seeing myself in their careful eyes and measured steps. And I never stopped trying to make their lives a little easier, a little brighter, speaking to them kindly when their employers ignored them, advocating for better wages and conditions whenever I had the opportunity. It was not much, perhaps, but it was something. Ambrose supported me in these efforts as he supported me in everything. He had been changed by our experiences, softened and opened in ways that made him unrecognizable from the cold, distant man I had first known. He took an active interest in the welfare of his tenants, investing his restored fortune in improvements to their cottages, building schools and hospitals, creating opportunities for people who had been born, as I had been, with nothing. We became known as reformers, Ambrose and I, the Duke and Duchess who believed that wealth came with responsibility, that privilege should be used for the benefit of others. Some of our peers approved, others thought us naive, or worse, dangerous. But we did not care. We had found a purpose beyond our own happiness, a way to make our good fortune mean something. The old fears do visit me sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the house is still and the shadows seem to hold memories. I wonder if I am truly worthy of this life, if the happiness I have found is too great to last. But then Ambrose stirs beside me, reaching for my hand even in sleep, and the fears dissolve like morning mist. We all carry doubts within us, I have learned. The difference between despair and hope is simply the choice we make about which voice to listen to. Lady Dorothea lived to see our 5th wedding anniversary, passing peacefully in her sleep on a quiet winter night. She left me her jewelry collection, every piece that had been in the vault and every piece she had worn throughout her life. But more than that, she left me a letter. In it, she wrote of her pride in the woman I had become, of her joy at seeing her nephew finally find happiness, of her certainty that the future of the Fitzroy family was in good hands. She wrote that I had taught her something important in her final years, that it was never too late to let go of old prejudices and embrace new possibilities. I keep that letter in a drawer beside my bed, and I read it whenever I need to remember the path I have walked. As for Cornelius Blackwood, his attempts to destroy us came to nothing in the end. His bitterness consumed him, leading him into unwise business dealings and legal troubles that stripped him of his fortune far more thoroughly than any judge could have done. The last I heard, he had retreated to a modest house in the North Country, a broken man whose dreams of empire had crumbled to dust. I cannot say I feel sorry for him, but neither do I feel the triumph I might once have expected. He made his choices, as we all do, and he must live with the consequences. That is the nature of life, I suppose. We are all writing our own stories, making decisions that will echo through the years, long after we are gone. The Duchess kept her secret and nearly destroyed her family. The old Duke sealed away his grief and lost decades to silence and regret. Cornelius Blackwood let his greed and pride lead him to ruin. And I, a poor housemaid with nothing but determination and a willingness to follow my instincts, stumbled upon a fortune and found love in the bargain. I do not pretend to understand why fate works the way it does. I only know that I am grateful, every day, for the strange and winding path that led me here. The sun has set now, and the lamps are being lit throughout the house. I can hear the distant sounds of the staff preparing for dinner, the familiar rhythms of a household at peace. In a few minutes, I will close this journal and go downstairs to join my husband, to sit across from him at the long dining table where I once served soup to his father, to share the meal and the evening and the rest of our lives. It is a strange and wonderful thing to be so thoroughly happy. There was a time when I would not have believed it possible. There was a time when I was invisible, moving through the world like a ghost, never daring to hope for more than survival. But that time is past. I am Flora Fitzroy, Duchess of Ashcroft, and this is my home. And the woman who found the vault, who discovered the treasure that saved everything, who followed a hidden passage into the darkness and emerged into the light, she is me as well. She always has been. I simply needed to find her. The clock in the hallway chimes the hour, and I set down my pen. Ambrose is waiting for me, as he always waits, as he always will, and I will go to him, as I always go, as I always will. Because that is what love is in the end. It is showing up. It is being present. It is choosing, again and again, to walk through the door and down the stairs and into the arms of the person who makes the world make sense. I have been given so many gifts in my life. The gift of discovery, the gift of courage, the gift of a love that defies every expectation. But the greatest gift of all is this, the knowledge that I am exactly where I am supposed to be, with exactly the person I am supposed to be with, living exactly the life I was always meant to live. That is worth more than 70 million pounds. That is worth more than all the gold in all the vaults in all the world. And as I descend the grand staircase of Ashcroft Hall, my hand trailing along the banister that I once polished to gleaming perfection, I smile at the thought of the housemaid I used to be. She would be proud, I think. She would be proud of everything I have become. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of my heart, where she still lives, she is smiling too.